I am honestly so exhausted from dealing with people who literally weaponize their smartphone decibel meters just to feel something. Like, this level of suburban petty is exactly why sovereign justice is needed in the first place, because I guess some folks just have way too much time on their hands. Let's just dive right into the madness.
Picture this. It's a Tuesday morning in Jupiter, Florida. The sun is already beating down like it owes somebody money. The humidity is resting at a comfortable 2,000%, and I am standing in my driveway holding a cup of coffee. I'm wearing basketball shorts and a faded t-shirt, just trying to enjoy the 3 minutes of peace I get before I have to log onto my computer for work. My rescue beagle, Buster, is sniffing a patch of St. Augustine grass near the front flower beds. He's doing what dogs do, minding his own business, smelling a phantom lizard. Suddenly, the bush next to him rustles. I freeze. Buster freezes. The leaves part, and out pops Beatrice. I am not exaggerating. A 70-something-year-old woman in a pastel pink visor and matching tennis skirt literally extracted herself from the middle of my prize-winning azaleas. And she wasn't empty-handed. She was holding her iPhone out like a weapon, with the screen glowing with some sort of third-party sound engineering app. Buster, startled by the sudden appearance of a pastel gremlin from the foliage, let out a sharp, confused sneeze. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't a growl. It was a sneeze. Beatrice thrust the phone closer to Buster's snout, tapped the screen with a manicured fingernail, and gasped with the theatricality of a daytime soap opera star. 54 decibels, she shrieked, her voice echoing off the stucco walls of my house. 54! I have it on record, David. I have it recorded. I just stared at her, blinking slowly as the caffeine tried to negotiate with my brain. Beatrice, what in the actual world are you doing in my bushes? Enforcing the covenants, conditions, and restrictions of the Whispering Palms Homeowners Association, she declared, marching out of the dirt and onto my driveway. She brushed a stray leaf off her shoulder, looking completely unapologetic about trespassing on my property to spy on my dog. Section 4, paragraph 12, amended as of last Thursday. No pets generating noise in excess of 50 decibels are permitted within the community boundaries. Your hound is in violation. I rubbed the bridge of my nose. He sneezed, Beatrice. He inhaled some pollen and expelled it. Are you telling me you're outlawing bodily functions now? A rule is a rule, she snapped. Pulling a pre-written citation from a clipboard I didn't even realize she had tucked under her arm. She slapped it onto the hood of my car. That is a $500 fine. And if that animal exceeds the noise limit again, you will be forced to remove him from the premises. Read the bylaws, David. With that, she turned on her heel, marched over to her customized lifted golf cart parked illegally in front of my mailbox, and sped off into the cul-de-sac. When I looked down at the bright yellow piece of paper on my car, $500 for a sneeze. Whispering Palms wasn't always like this. When I bought the place 3 years ago, it was just a quiet, slightly overpriced neighborhood with nice palm trees and a decent community pool. But then the old HOA president moved to Boca, and Beatrice seized the Iron Throne. She packed the board with her cronies, a terrifying coalition of retired busybodies who treated the neighborhood like a maximum security prison. They had banned street parking. They had banned basketball hoops. They had mandated that all mailboxes must be painted coastal beige. And last Thursday, in an emergency meeting that I missed because I was at the dentist, they passed the Quiet Enjoyment Pet Ordinance. 50 decibels. Do you know how quiet 50 decibels is? It's the sound of a moderate rainfall. It's the hum of a decent refrigerator. A normal human conversation clocks in at around 60 decibels. Beatrice had effectively outlawed every dog in the neighborhood that didn't have the vocal cords of a mime. Over the next 2 weeks, the neighborhood turned into a war zone. Beatrice and her golf cart patrol were everywhere. They handed out fines to the Smiths because their golden retriever barked at a squirrel. They fined the Garcias because their parrot squawked near an open window. And then, the unthinkable happened. The mailman dropped a package on my porch. Buster, doing his sworn duty as a dog, let out 2 loud, booming beagle howls. Beatrice was waiting. She had literally been parked 3 houses down. Radar gun, or rather decibel meter, ready. The fine was $1,000 this time, along with a certified letter from the HOA's terrifyingly aggressive legal counsel. Remove the animal within 48 hours, or face daily fines, liens on the property, and eventual foreclosure. I was furious. I was beyond furious. I was experiencing a level of rage that could have powered a small city, but I couldn't afford to lose my house, and I definitely couldn't afford thousands of dollars in legal battles just to keep my dog in a neighborhood that hated him. So, with a heavy heart, I packed up Buster's bed, his toys, and his favorite food bowls, and drove him 30 minutes across town to my parents' house. They had a massive, fenced-in backyard with no HOA and a neighbor who played the drums. Buster would be thrilled. I, however, was devastated. Driving back to my quiet, empty house felt like a funeral march. I walked into my kitchen, the silence ringing in my ears. I poured myself a generous glass of bourbon, sat down at my kitchen island, and slammed the 400-page Whispering Palms CC&R rulebook onto the granite counter. "You want to play games, Beatrice?" I thought, flipping open the heavy binder. "Let's play." I read the rules. I read every single line, every addendum, every microscopic footnote. I read it until my eyes blurred and the bourbon was gone. And then, around 3 in the morning, I found it. The exact wording of the amendment. No resident shall keep, harbor, or maintain any dog, cat, bird, or other domesticated animal that generates noise registering in excess of 50 decibels at the property line. They banned loud pets. They didn't ban lethal-looking ones. I opened my laptop and started typing. If Beatrice wanted a silent neighborhood, I was going to give her a silent neighborhood. I needed an animal that made absolutely zero noise, but commanded absolute pants-wetting respect from anyone who crossed its path. I looked into snakes. Too easy to hide. Beatrice wouldn't even notice a python until it was in her golf cart. Spiders? Too small. I needed something visible, something that would strike primal fear into the hearts of the HOA board members, while remaining completely within the legal bounds of their stupid noise ordinance. And then I found the holy grail of malicious compliance. Mephitis, the striped skunk. I went down a massive internet rabbit hole. Did you know you can keep a skunk as a pet? It's true. In many states, but with the right paperwork, you can own a fully domesticated skunk. And here is the best part. They are practically mute. A little chittering when they're hungry, maybe a foot stomp when they're annoyed, but they don't bark, they don't howl, and they certainly don't break 50 decibels. But there was a catch. I lived in Florida. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, FWC, classifies skunks as Class 3 wildlife. You can't just walk into a PetSmart and buy a skunk. Yet you need a permit. And more importantly, my HOA had a blanket clause that said, no wild animals, livestock, or agricultural pests. Beatrice would take one look at a skunk and try to have me arrested for harboring a wild nuisance. I needed an ironclad, state-level shield that the HOA couldn't touch. This is where the magic of legal loopholes comes in. I dove into state law, cross-referencing property rights with wildlife codes, and bingo, Florida Statute 373.185. This beautiful, So glorious piece of legislation explicitly forbids homeowners associations from prohibiting a homeowner from implementing Florida-friendly landscaping. The state passed it to protect water conservation and natural ecosystems. If a homeowner wants to turn their yard into a biological, eco-friendly haven, the HOA cannot stop them. How does a skunk fit into landscaping? Simple. Natural pest control. Skunks are voracious insectivores. They eat grubs, roaches, wasps, and beetles. Thus, if I registered my property as a Florida-friendly ecosystem utilizing natural biological pest deterrents and secured an FWC Class 3 captive wildlife permit for the skunk to act as that deterrent, state law would supersede the HOA's generic "no wild animals" rule. And because the skunk is virtually silent, it completely bypasses Beatrice's ridiculous 50-decibel pet ordinance. It was a masterpiece. It was a symphony of bureaucratic revenge. The next morning, I was on the phone. I tracked down a licensed exotic animal breeder in Ocala who specialized in domesticated, hand-raised skunks. "Hello, yes, is this Miller Exotics?" I asked, pacing my living room. "Sure is," a gruff voice answered. "What can I do for you?" "I'm interested in acquiring one of your striped skunks. A male, preferably. The biggest, fluffiest, most intimidating-looking one you have." The guy chuckled. "Intimidating? Buddy, they're basically just spicy cats. You know they come descented, right? We remove the scent glands when they're babies. They can't spray." "I know," I smiled, looking out the window toward the street, where Beatrice was currently measuring the distance between my neighbor's mailbox and the curb. "But nobody else needs to know that. Tell me, are they loud?" "Loud? Heck no. Quietest animal you'll ever own. Might scratch at the door if he wants a grape, but that's about it." "Perfect," I said. "I need him. What's the process?" "Well, you need your FWC Class 3 permit first. Can't sell him to you without it. Once you get that, you come up here, pay the adoption fee, and he's yours." Consider it done. For the next 3 weeks, I was a man on a mission. I filled out the FWC application with meticulous detail. Under the Purpose of Captivity section, and I didn't write pet, I wrote biological pest control agent for the maintenance of a state-protected Florida-friendly landscape ecosystem. I submitted my blueprints for an outdoor enclosure, passed the mandatory background check, and waited. Meanwhile, the HOA was running rampant. Beatrice fined a guy 3 streets over because his car door squeaked too loudly when he closed it. The neighborhood was living in terror. Finally, the email arrived. Permit approved. I rented an SUV and drove 3 hours north to Ocala and walked into the breeder's facility. And there he was, Barnaby. He was magnificent. He weighed about 12 pounds, had a coat as black as midnight, and possessed 2 stark, brilliant white racing stripes down his back. His tail was a massive, bushy plume of doom. He looked like the physical embodiment of a biohazard warning. The breeder handed him to me. Barnaby immediately nuzzled into my neck and let out a soft, barely audible chuff sound. "And he likes you," the breeder smiled. "Loves strawberries, hates sudden movements. Good luck with him." "Oh," I said, strapping Barnaby into a specialized escape-proof travel carrier. "The luck isn't for me. It's for my HOA president." The drive back to Jupiter was uneventful. Barnaby slept the entire way, completely silent. When I pulled into my driveway, the sun was just starting to set. I carried the kennel inside, set it on the living room floor, and opened the door. Barnaby waddled out, sniffed the sofa, found a stray Cheerio under the coffee table, ate it, and curled up on my rug. Total noise level? Maybe 5 decibels. Phase 1 was complete. I had the silent weapon. Now, I needed to build the battlefield. The very next morning, I woke up, and Barnaby was literally just asleep in my laundry basket, curled up in a pair of my gym shorts like a little black and white croissant. Honestly, I stood there looking at him for a solid 5 minutes, sipping my coffee, just marveling at how absolutely quiet he was. He didn't bark at the garbage truck rumbling by outside. He didn't whimper. He didn't even breathe heavily. I mean, he was the perfect roommate. But keeping him hidden in my house wasn't the goal here. The goal was malicious compliance on a neighborhood-wide scale. If Beatrice and the Whispering Palms HOA board wanted to take me to civil court over a noise ordinance, I needed my legal armor to be completely bulletproof. I couldn't just say, "Hey, but look, my skunk is quiet." I had to legally transform Barnaby from a pet into a vital, state-protected component of my property's ecosystem. I needed to physically manifest Florida Statute 373.185. I needed an actual, undeniable, Florida-friendly landscape habitat, and I needed it built right out in the open where Beatrice's decibel meter couldn't do a single thing about it. So I picked up my phone and called Mike. Let me tell you about Mike. Mike is a local contractor who looks like he wrestles alligators on the weekends for cardio. The guy is built like a cinder block, constantly wears a high-vis shirt that is somehow always stained with drywall mud, and he has a beard that probably has its own zip code. He owed me a favor from a couple of years ago when I helped him untangle a nightmare of a permitting issue for his cousin's roofing business. I knew he wouldn't ask too many questions, which was exactly what I needed. It's because what I was about to ask him to build was, frankly, a little unhinged. Mike pulled into my driveway less than an hour later in a battered Ford F25. Oh, that sounded like it was gargling gravel. He hopped out, adjusted his tool belt, and walked up to me on the patio. "All right, Dave," Mike said, pulling a chewed-up pencil from behind his ear. "What's the emergency? You sounded like you were planning a bank heist on the phone." "Not a heist, Mike," I said, unrolling a crude blueprint I had sketched out on my kitchen table the night before. "I guess you could call it a sanctuary. I need you to build me a reinforced escape-proof biological pest control enclosure, right here on the side patio. And I need it integrated with native Florida flora." Mike stared at the paper, then stared at me. He scratched his beard. "So, buddy, you want a reinforced steel mesh run, integrated with native saw palmettos, anchored into the concrete. For a cat?" "Not a cat, Mike," I said, leaning in conspiratorially. "A biological pest deterrent." Mike squinted, clearly trying to process if I had completely lost my mind. "Right. A deterrent. Does it bite? Are we talking about a bobcat here, Dave? Because I'm not building a cage for a cougar. I got kids." "It doesn't bite," I reassured him, holding back a laugh. "It's very friendly. Actually, it's legally classified as Class 3 wildlife, but it's completely domesticated." "But you might want to hold your breath if you make him mad." "Hold my breath?" Mike literally took a step back. "Dave, what the hell did you buy?" "Just build the enclosure, Mike. Heavy-gauge wire, predator-proof latches, and we need to plant coontie palms, beautyberry, and saw palmettos all around the perimeter. It has to look like a botanical garden crossed with a maximum security prison. Can you do it by Friday?" Mike looked at the blueprints again, did some mental math, and sighed. Yeah, I guess I can do it, but I'm charging you the weird animal tax. This is gonna run you about $3,000, and I'm bringing my thickest gloves." "Worth every penny," I said, shaking his hand. By Tuesday afternoon, my side yard sounded like an industrial shipyard. Mike and his two-man crew were out there with hammer drills, angle grinders, and a cement mixer, anchoring heavy steel posts into my patio. The noise was glorious. It was a cacophony of construction, well over 90 decibels, but perfectly legal, Because, according to the Whispering Palms CC and RS, construction noise from licensed contractors was permitted between the hours of 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. Naturally, it took exactly 14 minutes for Beatrice to show up. I was sitting in my living room, watching Barnaby lazily bat at a ping-pong ball, when I saw the flash of pastel pink through my front window. Beatrice's golf cart practically skidded onto my driveway, tires squealing against the pavers. She leapt out, but her decibel meter thrust into the air like Excalibur, her face twisted in a mask of absolute outrage. I casually strolled out the front door, sipping a glass of iced tea. "David!" she screamed over the sound of Mike's angle grinder throwing sparks against steel. "What is the meaning of this? Stop this immediately! You are violating the quiet enjoyment of the entire community!" "Hey, Beatrice," I yelled back, adopting a tone of cheerful innocence. "Just getting some landscaping done. A beautiful day for it, isn't it?" "Landscaping?" She marched toward the side gate, trying to peer around the corner. "That sounds like a heavy industrial manufacturing plant. You do not have approval from the Architectural Review Committee for any structural additions. I am shutting this down." I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a beautifully laminated manila folder. I had prepared for this exact moment. I walked over and handed it to her. "Actually, Beatrice, and if you consult Florida Statute 373.185, you'll see that homeowners associations are explicitly prohibited from restricting property owners from implementing Florida-friendly landscaping. What you are hearing right now is the installation of a state-sanctioned, eco-conscious biological habitat. It is exempt from HOA architectural vetoes under state law, as it promotes water conservation and natural pest management. Beatrice stared at the laminated packet like I had just handed her a live grenade. She adjusted her reading glasses, scanning the legal jargon, her lips moving silently. "Biological habitat?" she scoffed, though her voice wavered a bit. "What are you talking about, David? What pests?" "Oh, you know," I said, waving vaguely at the grass. "Grubs, palmetto bugs, the usual Florida stuff. I'm just doing my part for the environment. And the construction noise is well within the permitted hours outlined in Section 7 of your own rule book. So, unless you want to call the State Environmental Protection Agency and tell them you're blocking a conservation effort, I suggest you let Mike finish his work." She literally vibrated with rage. I mean, I could see the veins pulsing in her neck. She looked from me to the laminated statute, to Mike, but who was currently wrestling a massive saw palmetto root ball into the ground while making aggressive eye contact with her. "This isn't over, David," Beatrice hissed, shoving the folder back into my chest. "I am going to have the board's attorney review this. If you are building an unapproved dog run for that howling beagle of yours, I will personally see to it that your house is leaned into oblivion." "Buster is staying with my parents, Beatrice," I said, as to keeping my smile firmly plastered on my face. "I assure you, whatever is going into that habitat won't make a single sound." She stomped back to her golf cart, slammed her foot on the accelerator, and sped off, nearly clipping my mailbox. I just chuckled and went back inside. Checkmate, Phase 2. By Friday evening, the enclosure was finished. And honestly, it was a masterpiece. Mike had over-engineered the living daylights out of it. It had reinforced steel mesh, a triple-latch door system, and a beautifully landscaped perimeter of native Florida ferns and palms that perfectly masked the heavy-duty hardware. It looked like a luxury exhibit at a high-end zoo. I paid Mike, gave him a solid tip, and watched him drive off, still shaking his head in confusion. Now, it was time for the premiere. It was time for Barnaby's first official patrol of the Whispering Palms common areas. Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear. The neighborhood was quiet, and save for the hum of pool pumps, and the distant thwack of a tennis ball. I went into the living room, where Barnaby was sleeping underneath the sofa. "All right, buddy," I whispered, pulling out the tiny tactical black harness I had ordered online. "Time to go to work." Putting a harness on a skunk is exactly like trying to put a bra on a water balloon. They are incredibly squishy, surprisingly heavy for their size, and they just sort of melt out of your hands. But Barnaby was a good sport. After a few minutes of wrangling and bribing him with half a strawberry, I got the harness secured. I clipped on a sleek black leash, and we walked to the front door. I took a deep breath. I felt a surge of adrenaline, mixed with a healthy dose of petty excitement. I opened the door and stepped out into the Florida sunshine. Barnaby waddled out behind me. He didn't scamper. He didn't run. He just sort of slinked forward with this heavy, confident, low-to-the-ground swagger. His massive, bushy black and white tail was held high like a battle flag. We hit the sidewalk and started our stroll toward the community fountain at the center of the neighborhood. The first encounter happened about 3 houses down. Brenda, the neighborhood gossip, was out retrieving her newspaper. She was wearing a fluffy bathrobe and holding a massive, metallic pink Stanley cup. She looked up, ready to wave and offer some passive-aggressive comment about my lawn, yet when her eyes locked onto the end of my leash, time seemed to slow down. I watched the blood literally drain from Brenda's face. Her jaw went slack, her fingers unclasped. The Stanley cup slipped from her grasp and hit the concrete driveway with a deafening metallic clang, spilling ice water everywhere. Barnaby didn't even flinch. He just paused, sniffed a dandelion growing out of a crack in the sidewalk, and kept waddling. Total silence. 0 decibels. Brenda didn't scream. But I think she was too terrified to open her mouth. Terrified that any sudden noise would cause the wild skunk to unleash a cloud of chemical warfare upon her driveway. She just slowly, rigidly, backed up the driveway and slipped inside her front door, closing it without making a sound. "Morning, Brenda," I called out cheerfully, though the door was already shut. We continued our walk. The neighborhood was waking up, and the reactions were honestly the funniest thing I have ever witnessed in my entire life. A guy named Gary, who was out jogging in khaki shorts and a visor, came around the corner near the koi pond. He was listening to his AirPods, completely in the zone. He looked down, saw Barnaby, and his brain simply short-circuited. He didn't calculate that a skunk on a leash was probably safe. He just let primal instinct take over. Gary let out a highly undignified yelp, tripped over his own feet, and literally dove sideways into the decorative community fountain to avoid crossing our path. Water splashed everywhere. "Hey, Gary," I nodded, as we casually strolled past the splashing, coughing man. "Water's a bit chilly today, huh?" Barnaby just chattered his teeth lightly, a happy sound that skunks make, registering at roughly the volume of a moth hitting a light bulb, and tugged me toward a patch of clover. By the time we made it to the central clubhouse lawn, the neighborhood telegraph had clearly been buzzing. People were peeking out from behind their blinds. A lawn care crew had completely abandoned their mowers and were standing on the bed of their pickup truck, pointing at us. And then I heard it. The high-pitched whine of an electric motor being pushed to its absolute limits. Beatrice was incoming. Her golf cart crested the small hill near the clubhouse, flying over a speed bump with reckless abandon. She slammed on the brakes about 20 feet away from us, her tires tearing up the manicured grass. She had her phone out, Decibel app open, but she didn't dare step out of the cart. "David!" she screeched, her voice trembling. What is that vermin?" I stopped. Barnaby sat down on the sidewalk, scratched his ear with his back foot, and looked at Beatrice with mild curiosity. "This?" I smiled broadly, gesturing down at the fluff ball of doom. "This is Barnaby. He's my new biological pest control agent. He's part of the Florida-friendly landscaping initiative we discussed." "That is a skunk!" she yelled, pointing a shaking finger at him. "You are walking a rabid, wild skunk in the common areas. Are you out of your mind?" "He's not rabid, Beatrice," I said calmly, "and he's not wild. He's fully domesticated, and more importantly, Beatrice, I'd like you to check your app. Go ahead. Look at the decibel meter." She glanced down at her phone, then glared back at me. "Barnaby hasn't made a single sound," I continued, taking a step closer, which caused Beatrice to shrink back into the vinyl seat of her cart. "Not a bark, not a howl, not a peep. I believe he is currently registering at ambient neighborhood volume. I am in full compliance with the newly amended Section 4, Paragraph 12 of the HOA covenants." You are violating the nuisance clause," she stammered, frantically trying to find a new angle of attack. "Oh, that animal is a biohazard. It is a threat to the safety and well-being of the residents." "Oh, Beatrice, please," I laughed, scratching Barnaby behind the ears. "He's legally permitted by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. He is state-sanctioned. If you have a problem with him, you'll have to take it up with Tallahassee. But as far as the Whispering Palms Homeowners Association is concerned, he is a perfectly legal, perfectly silent pet. Now, if you'll excuse us, Barnaby has some grubs to hunt." I turned my back on her and started walking back toward my house. "I am calling the authorities!" Beatrice screamed at my back, her voice echoing across the silent lawns. "I am having you evicted, David. I am having that pest exterminated by animal control. You haven't heard the end of this." I didn't even turn around. I just waved over my shoulder and yelled back, "Have a blessed day, Beatrice!" I honestly couldn't wait for her to call the cops, because she had no idea the trap she was walking right into. Honestly, I didn't even make it fully back to my front porch before I heard the sirens. I mean, Beatrice must have literally called them the second I turned my back, and knowing her, she probably told them there was an active biological terror threat waddling through the pristine streets of Whispering Palms. I scooped Barnaby up, tucked him under my arm like a fuzzy black and white football, sat down in the Adirondack chair on my porch. I poured myself a fresh glass of iced tea, and just waited. Within 3 minutes, a Boca Raton police cruiser came tearing around the corner, lights flashing, followed closely by a white county animal control truck. They parked haphazardly, blocking my driveway, and 2 officers stepped out of the cruiser. Now, do you know how funny it is to see a fully grown, heavily armed police officer instinctively cower behind the open door of his cruiser? Because that's exactly what happened. The older officer, a guy who looked like he'd seen every weird crime South Florida had to offer, took one look at the animal sitting in my lap and physically flinched. "Sir!" the officer yelled, keeping a solid 20 feet of distance between us. His hand was literally hovering over his belt. "Sir, I need you to put the animal down and step away. Slowly!" I took a sip of my iced tea. Barnaby sniffed the rim of the glass and chittered softly. "Afternoon. Was officers. Beautiful day, isn't it? What seems to be the problem?" "We received a frantic 911 call from a Mrs. Beatrice Vance," the younger cop said, reading off a notepad while standing directly behind his partner, stating that a resident was actively walking a rabid, wild predator through the neighborhood common areas. Is that a skunk?" "This is Barnaby," I smiled, holding him up slightly so they could see the little black tactical harness. "He's my biological pest control agent. Would you guys like to pet him? He's incredibly soft." Both officers took a synchronized, massive step backward. "Absolutely not," the older cop said, visibly sweating now. "Listen, buddy, I don't care what you call it, you cannot harbor a wild skunk in a residential neighborhood. That is a massive public health hazard. At that moment, the animal control officer finally walked up, and she was a no-nonsense woman in green cargo pants, holding one of those long metal catch poles with the loop on the end. She marched up my driveway, took one look at Barnaby sitting in my lap wearing a tiny harness, and immediately lowered the pole. She just stared at me, deadpan. "Please tell me that thing is descented," she sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Like a breeze on a summer day," I assured her. "Right," she said, walking up the steps to my porch, completely ignoring the terrified cops behind her. "I still need to see your paperwork. You know the drill. Nobody keeps a skunk in Florida without Tallahassee knowing about it." "I was hoping you'd say that," I grinned. I reached under my chair and pulled out my heavy black 3-ring binder. The Sovereign Justice Special. I flipped it open to the first tab and handed it to her. "Here's my Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission Class 3 Captive Wildlife Permit," I said, pointing to the official state seal. "Issued 3 weeks ago. Fully authorized. And behind that, you'll find Barnaby's complete veterinary records, including his rabies vaccination, distemper shots, and the surgical certificate confirming the removal of his scent glands." The animal control officer flipped through the pages, her eyebrows raising slightly. "Well, I'll be. It's all here. Registered address matches. Microchip number matches." She looked down at Barnaby, who was now attempting to chew on the corner of my binder. "He's a handsome little guy." "Thank you," I said. "He's a very good boy. And very quiet." "Wait, hold on," a shrill voice suddenly shrieked from the street. I looked up. Beatrice had parked her golf cart behind the police cruiser and was marching up the driveway, flanked by 2 of her HOA board cronies. She looked like she was ready to personally execute me. "Officers!" Beatrice yelled, pointing an accusing finger at me. "Arrest him!" What that animal is in direct violation of the Whispering Palms Homeowners Association covenants. We explicitly ban wild animals and agricultural pests. His permits do not matter here. The HOA rules supersede his little state paperwork on private community property." The 2 cops looked at the animal control officer, who just shrugged and handed my binder back to me. "Actually, ma'am," the animal control officer said to Beatrice, "state permits generally do override local ordinances when it comes to classified wildlife, but I guess that's a civil matter for your lawyers. As far as the county is concerned, this animal is legally owned, properly vaccinated, and completely safe. I have no grounds to confiscate it." "Civil matter?" Beatrice shrieked, her face turning an impressive shade of magenta. "It is a biohazard. It is a nuisance. He is intentionally terrorizing the neighborhood." "Beatrice, honestly, I think you need to take a deep breath before you pop a blood vessel," I said, standing up and opening the binder to the second tab. "Because you are fundamentally misunderstanding the legal classification of my property right now." I pulled out the laminated copies of the state laws and walked over to the edge of the porch, handing them down to the police officers and Beatrice. "If you consult Florida Statute 373.185, I said, on my voice projecting clearly so the gathering crowd of nosy neighbors could hear every word, you will see that the state of Florida explicitly forbids any homeowners association from enacting or enforcing rules that prohibit a property owner from implementing Florida-friendly landscaping." "Landscaping?" Beatrice practically spat the word. "That is a skunk, David, not a petunia." "It is a biological pest control agent," I corrected her calmly, tapping the FWC permit, "which I have specifically registered with the state as an integral component of my eco-friendly, chemical-free, Florida-friendly yard. I am utilizing native natural predators to manage insect populations, which promotes water conservation and prevents chemical runoff into the community lakes. By attempting to remove Barnaby, you are actively interfering with a state-protected environmental conservation effort. The older police officer looked down at the statute, read the highlighted section, and then looked back up at Beatrice. You could literally see the realization wash over his face that he was stuck in the middle of an HOA turf war. He let out a long, exhausted sigh and holstered his radio. "Ma'am," the cop said, his tone instantly shifting from defensive to completely over it. "He has the state permits, he has the wildlife classification, and he has a statutory loophole that I am absolutely not paid enough to argue with. This is a civil dispute. And if you have a problem with his landscaping, you take it to court. But do not call 911 again for a permitted pet, or I will cite you for misuse of the emergency dispatch system." You can't be serious!" Beatrice gasped, clutching her pearls, like she literally clutched a string of pearls around her neck. "Have a good afternoon, folks," the younger cop said, practically sprinting back to the cruiser. The animal control officer gave Barnaby one last scratch behind the ears, chuckled to herself, and walked back to her truck. Within 30 seconds, the authorities were gone, leaving Beatrice standing in my driveway, completely legally neutralized. I looked down at her. "So, Beatrice, I guess the only metric you can legally judge Barnaby on now is your own noise ordinance. You know, Section 4, Paragraph 12. So tell me, did his breathing exceed 50 decibels today?" She didn't say a word. She just spun around, marched back to her golf cart, and drove away so fast she left a tire mark on my pavers. I thought that would be the end of it. I really did. I figured the police shutting her down in front of half the neighborhood would be enough to break her spirit. But I underestimated the sheer, petty resilience of a Florida HOA president with a bruised ego. 3 days later, I found a certified letter taped to my front door. It was an official summons to a mandatory emergency hearing of the Whispering Palms HOA Board of Directors. The charge? Creating a hazardous and hostile living environment. The penalty? An immediate lien on my property and forced eviction if the hazard was not removed. She was doubling down. She had hired the HOA's terrifying, overpriced corporate lawyer, a guy named Sterling, to try and legally bully me into submission. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday night at the community clubhouse. I honestly couldn't wait. Thursday evening arrived, and the clubhouse was packed. It was like the entire neighborhood had turned out for a public execution. Residents were whispering excitedly, sitting in rows of folding chairs. At the front of the room, behind a long folding table, sat the 5 members of the HOA board. Beatrice was in the center, looking incredibly smug, wearing a power suit. Next to her sat Sterling, the lawyer, looking like he charged $500 an hour just to breathe. I walked into the room at exactly 7 p.m., and I didn't walk in alone. No, I had Barnaby perched right on my shoulder like a pirate's parrot. The reaction was instantaneous. The entire room gasped. Half of the front row physically threw themselves backward out of their folding chairs. One of the board members, an elderly man named Arthur, actually yelped and dove under the folding table. "Order!" Beatrice screamed, slamming a wooden gavel down on the table. "Order in this meeting! David, remove that! That beast from this facility immediately!" "I have a right to attend my own disciplinary hearing, Beatrice," I said casually, walking down the center aisle. Barnaby was just chilling on my shoulder, softly chittering, completely unfazed by the fluorescent lights. And Barnaby is my registered emotional support biological pest deterrent. He goes where I go. I took a seat in the single chair placed in front of the board's table. I crossed my legs, thus adjusted Barnaby so he was sitting comfortably in my lap, and smiled at the lawyer. "Let's get this over with. I have to feed him his Evening beetles. Sterling, the lawyer, cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. He looked at Barnaby nervously, but tried to maintain his professional composure. Mr. Vance, you are appearing before this board under the charge of violating the community's safety and hazard regulations. Your animal constitutes a direct threat to the health, safety, and quiet enjoyment of the residents of Whispering Palms. Does it? I asked, feigning shock. How so? It is a wild skunk, Mr. Vance, Sterling said, speaking to me like I was a toddler. It is capable of discharging a noxious chemical spray that can cause temporary blindness, extreme nausea, and permanent property damage. The board has a fiduciary duty to protect the community from such a hazard. Ah, I nodded slowly. I see. Oh, so your entire legal argument rests on the assumption that Barnaby is a spraying hazard. It is a biological fact, Mr. Vance, Sterling sneered. And no amount of state landscaping loopholes can override the HOA's right to remove an active, dangerous weapon from the premises. I let him finish. I let the silence hang in the room for a solid 10 seconds. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Sterling, I said, leaning forward. So did Beatrice pay you for this consultation? Because honestly, you should probably refund her. You clearly didn't do your homework. I slid the paper across the table. Sterling picked it up cautiously. What you are holding, I announced to the entire room, is a certified veterinary surgical record from Miller Exotics in Ocala, Florida. It officially documents that Barnaby underwent a successful anal sacculectomy at 4 weeks of age. Sterling stared at the paper, but the color began to drain from his face. For those of you who don't speak Latin, I continued, looking directly at Beatrice, that means Barnaby was surgically descented. He physically cannot spray. He has no scent glands. He is no more hazardous than a fluffy black and white house cat. The room erupted into murmurs. Beatrice snatched the paper out of Sterling's hand, her eyes darting frantically across the page. "This is a forgery!" she yelled, her voice cracking. It's signed by a state-licensed veterinarian, Beatrice, I said calmly, and backed by my FWC Class 3 permit. So let's review the facts, shall we? Barnaby is legally classified as a captive wildlife pet. He is state-sanctioned as a Florida-friendly landscaping biological deterrent. He is surgically incapable of producing any odor or hazard. And most importantly, I paused, pointing a finger directly at her decibel meter sitting on the table. He registers at 0 decibels, which means he is the only pet in this entire neighborhood currently in full compliance with your ridiculous noise ordinance. Sterling, the lawyer, let out a long, heavy sigh. He closed his briefcase with a loud snap. He leaned over and whispered something into Beatrice's ear. She shook her head furiously, but he just gave her a stern, final look and stood up. "The board," Sterling announced to the silent room, looking incredibly defeated, "withdraws the citation. Mr. Vance is in compliance." "But—" Beatrice started to protest. "Beatrice, drop it!" Sterling hissed, loud enough for the front row to hear. "He has you boxed in on 3 different state levels. You touch that skunk, and he'll own the clubhouse." I stood up, brushing a stray black hair off my shirt. Barnaby let out a tiny, happy squeak. "Well, if that's all," I smiled, turning to face the crowd of stunned neighbors. "I'm going to go pick up my beagle from my parents' house. It turns out, according to the state, I can keep both my quiet landscaping agent and my dog, since you guys can't legally step foot on my property to measure decibels anymore without violating my state-protected eco-habitat." I walked out of the clubhouse, the silence behind me absolutely deafening. I mean, it was easily less than 50 decibels. The next day, Beatrice resigned from the board. The remaining members immediately repealed the Quiet Enjoyment Pet Ordinance. I brought Buster home that afternoon, and honestly, seeing him happily sniffing Barnaby in the backyard was the greatest victory I could have asked for. And that, my friends, is why you always read the rulebook. Because sometimes the best way to fight a loud, obnoxious tyrant is with a completely silent, weaponized skunk.